Welcome to Fasken's 2022 mining series. This is our 12th consecutive series. I am Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm part of the Fasken Global Mining Group. It's such a pleasure to be here today. We are finishing up our first week of the series. This is our 8th of 15 sessions, which continue until next Wednesday. Please refer to the slide on your screen for some housekeeping items following the presentation. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Andrew House, the moderator for Critical Clubs, International Alliance Making, and the role of the state in critical mineral control. And Andrew will introduce the panel. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Virginia. And I can't fault you for stumbling over 2020 versus 2022. Sometimes I think we all feel like we are perpetually stuck in a year that will never end. I really appreciate everyone who's joined us here today. I'm hopeful that next year, maybe we do this in a hybrid format where we can look you in the eye, just as you're looking us in the eye, and we can all be together. For this year, this is the format that we're in, and we will make the very best of it. It goes without saying that we are living in very interesting, very difficult days. It is literally hard to tear ourselves away from what's unfolding on our TV screens hour by hour. And I appreciate each of you being here with us today. I suspect some of you have tuned in because you see in the current conflict echoes of a broader struggle, one in which Canada and its allies have perhaps not fully engaged and are understandably grappling with how to do so. On March 11, 2021, Canada released its critical mineral list consisting of 31 items. This was, for many observers, the first concrete statement by Canada about what our country believes it needs to secure its future in a critical minerals sense and the future of its allies. We'll touch today on approximately 5 sub-themes related to state control of and participation in the global critical minerals industry. Chief among those will be the following question: is the West being tested? What is that test? And are we passing it? How will we know? We've got some great panelists that I'm going to introduce in just a moment. By way of introduction of myself, I'm Andrew House. I'm a partner here at Fasken. Along with my friend and colleague, Marcia Mills, I lead Fasken's National Security Group. One of the things that our group is chiefly focused on, especially in the last 2 years, is the idea of critical infrastructure as part of Canada's national security. And a chief part of Canada's critical infrastructure is and should be critical minerals. My role today is to help guide a discussion on what I will describe as 2 solitudes. The first is a state level imperative. The first duty of the state, famously, is to see to the safety and security of its citizens, to secure those items, processes, and goods that literally keep Canadians fed, healthy, safe, and well. And the question that I think has plagued our country throughout the pandemic is, were we ready for this? Had we sufficiently prepared? That's one solitude. The other solitude is simply the harsh business reality of how you envision, build, protect, cause a business to flourish, and ultimately how you exit that business, sometimes in an M&A sense. And we're going to hear some really interesting commentary, particularly from one of our panelists. Let me go ahead and introduce the folks who've graciously agreed to join us today. I'll start with my colleague from here at Fasken. Janet Howard is a corporate transactions lawyer focusing on natural resources and renewable energy. She advises clients on complex corporate finance, M&A, and private equity. She's also co-founder of Fasken's Hydrogen Energy Advisory Group, which is an interesting innovation here at Fasken that I'll ask Janet to touch on briefly in her remarks. She also assists clients in financing and development of renewable energy projects. She's a member of our China practice group and has represented, interestingly, Zijin Mining in connection with its acquisition of Nebsun Resources. She is, and I'm impressed by this because I understand the New York bar is very tough. She's a member of the Bar of Ontario and New York, and has recently joined me as we have agreed to sit on the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's newly launched Critical Minerals Council. It's a privilege for Janet and I to team up to do that. Next, I'd like to introduce you to a fellow who I will disclose as an old friend. Chuvaloy Majumder is a senior Munk fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Shuv has lived several lives across politics, academia, overseas deployments, and those of us who have worked with him are convinced there are several other pages of redacted CV that someday he's going to divulge to all of us. But he brings to our panel experience in global affairs at the highest levels, having served as Director of Policy to successive Canadian foreign ministers. Shuv was based in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2006 to 2010, where he led the International Republican Institute, which is a Washington-based nonpartisan organization chaired by former US Senator John McCain, who so many of us hold in high esteem. Shuv is the person I go to when I want to understand what's happening outside of Canada's borders, and then have that translated into the domestic political and policy sphere. So I'm really pleased he could be with us. And finally, last but not least, I'm extremely pleased to have with us today Carlos Vicenz, who for the last 5 years has served as Chief Financial Officer of none other than Lithium Corporation that you've all heard so much about. Lithium recently achieved what some felt would not get done, the acquisition of that corporation by Zijin Mining. There's been, of course, no lack of interest in this deal from media, politicians, analysts, and the investment community generally. We're very pleased to have Carlos with us to bring a practical perspective of a marketplace player, someone who's been in the trenches of M&A under very difficult circumstances and come out the other side, not without some scars, but also a huge amount of success. We're very pleased to have Carlos agree to speak to us today. I'm going to turn quickly to what I'm calling Critical Minerals 101, and I'll be relying on Janet Howard to talk to us about why certain minerals are deemed critical, what makes a mineral critical, and how should we sort of be viewing minerals through that lens. Everything from missile guidance systems, rechargeable batteries, solar panels, computer hard drives, catalytic converters, MRI scanners, wind turbines. Each of these has something in common. They all depend on what Canada now defines as critical minerals. So Janet, maybe if you can for a few minutes, take us back to basics. What are the critical minerals? What makes them critical? And why do we care so much about them?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. And before I get started, I just want to thank Carlos and Shu for joining us today, and for those participating in the webinar. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We've got some people with some true experience in this industry looking at this issue, and I would encourage people to use the chat function to ask questions, because to the extent we can make this conversation interactive, I think it will be that much more relevant and interesting for its purposes. So just preliminary comments to provide some context to hopefully frame the discussion. What are the critical minerals? Why are they critical? And how have they been identified? People in government have made it relatively easy for us to identify what the critical minerals are because they have assembled lists. They've assembled them in the US. I'll make reference to the US National Science and Technology Council. They've identified 35 minerals they describe as being critical to the US economy, whose supply could be vulnerable to disruption. In Canada, Andrew has noted, we've got a list of 31 critical minerals that have been identified. We don't yet have a critical minerals strategy, the same way other countries have. That's an interesting point to note. Something that is worth noting in the materials that are being produced by Natural Resources Canada, they're grouping these critical minerals into categories of use. They're focusing on minerals that are useful for the purposes of zero emissions vehicles, aluminum, cobalt, copper, lithium, the battery minerals. The next field of use, information technology, with a focus on gallium. And then there's a focus on future energy storage and generation, with specific reference put on cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, and also uranium. So in the next point, why are these critical? I think it's helpful to focus on certain attributes that we can be mindful of. The first being supply is limited, and there could be a few reasons why supply is limited. First, critical minerals can be unevenly distributed around the world. And that means some countries have monopolies on their production. You can think about China and rare earths, DRC, cobalt. Some are rare and therefore not abundant, so its supply is limited. In other instances, some are abundant, but extraction can be complicated, necessitating the need for refining and processing that might be required, which adds time and expense. And the second point to focus on in terms of why they're critical, increasingly there's recognition of the importance of critical minerals to national economies and also to national security. Access and availability to these minerals can enable domestic manufacturing, promoting job creation, which is an activity that strengthens national economies, which is especially relevant now given the impact of COVID, not only on national economies, but also on our supply chains, and even more so arguably in light of the war in Europe. On the national security angle, a statement was made in the US executive order issued in 2021 that caught my eye. And there's reference in this statement to several concerns that may be keeping some of us up at night, and I'll read it to you. The statement reads, pandemics and other biological threats, cyber attacks, climate shocks, and extreme weather events, terrorist attacks, geopolitical and economic competition, and other conditions can reduce critical manufacturing capacity and the availability of and integrity of critical goods, products, and services. So there's a clear link there, linking these minerals to enabling the type of critical manufacturing that can help countries address and respond to these threats. So why do some minerals end up on the list and get designated as critical? How was that decision made? And when you work through the material, there are some factors that jump out. I think it's fair to say minerals get designated critical if domestic manufacturers start to rely on foreign supplies, if there's a likelihood that supplies could be disrupted, and existing manufacturers if they're not well positioned to deal with those disruptions. And just in closing my remarks on the first theme, Andrew, I can refer to some statistics that have been made available by Natural Resources Canada that will be relevant to the discussion we'll shortly have. China is now the leading producer and processor of several minerals that have been deemed vital to the modern economy. So specifically, they're a leading producer and processor of 59% of the lithium, 70% of the graphite, 36% of the cobalt, 95% of the calcium, 56% of the vanadium, and 80% of the rare earth elements.
Thank you, Janet. I'm just struck by this executive order it's now a couple of years old, but it dates from the early days of the Biden presidency, and it's very interesting that the president has equated climate change with national security. In fact, he's just absolutely said climate change is a national emergency. It is a matter of the vital security interests of the United States of America. Talk to us just for a moment about your practice in relation to hydrogen and the transformation of the energy economy. How does that tie in? How did the environment suddenly become front and center in a national security debate in the United States?
To respond to that, I'd like to back up with the word electrification. And I think that word resonates with those in the mining sector because there's a big focus on integrating the type of battery minerals, the minerals that are necessary to electrify production industry for the purposes of removing dependence on oil and natural gas, things that emit carbon into the atmosphere. And fair to say, a few years ago, this focus on Paris Accords, reducing GHG emissions, achieving net zero, these are all things that as responsible corporate citizens, people tend to be focused on, but it's become much more meaningful in the sense that institutional investors, regulators are now mandating these reductions. Governments have targets to achieve net zero. And when you're a mining company, the statistics, I have them written somewhere, I won't flip to it, but it's an enormous percentage of GHG emissions that the mining sector as a whole contributes. So that presents a real opportunity for the mining sector, in my view. Mining companies sometimes are faced with this burden of being producers of dirty energy, polluters. I'd argue to the contrary. Mining companies have proven themselves time and time again to be responsible corporate citizens. It's necessary to have the social license, the focus and attention to health and security. The mining companies are leading the effort in terms of figuring out ways to integrate clean technologies for the purposes of reducing Scope 3 emissions. And there's an alignment between what's going on in the energy sector in terms of this energy transition. I'll call it an energy transition, transitioning away from oil and gas, fuels that pollute, increase GHG emissions, and integrating these types of clean technologies. And the need for the electrification minerals to promote those efforts is significant. And in connection with those comments, I would flag a distinction that I think is relevant to make. There's a difference between promoting electrification through battery minerals and promoting clean electricity, reducing GHGs through hydrogen. There's room for both. And with reference to the work we're doing here at the firm, we have assembled a group of people who are focused on assisting clients in terms of advancing the identification of renewable energy sources for the purposes of producing hydrogen that can be made available to decarbonize heavy industrial application manufacturing. And mining companies, I think, stand to benefit to a great extent from those efforts, getting the long haul heavy trucks off of diesel, powering refineries and smelters with clean renewable energy, generating carbon credits that can eventually be used to offset Scope 3 emissions by these companies. There's value there. So there's a lot of detail in there. I hope I've answered the question, but if you think about those themes generally, you start to appreciate some of the links between the energy sector, the mining industry, and how climate change presents an opportunity for those two sectors to collaborate and to also actively address some of the concerns and present some meaningful solutions.
Shuv, I'm going to come to you for a moment and talk to you about an area that's a real area of expertise for you, and that's the level of state security and how states secure their essential interests. Scarcity of supply has always been a driver of conflict and controversy, basically throughout time. People fight over things that they can't easily access. They fight to stockpile. They fight to secure that supply, to see to their essential interests. Part of what states tend to do in this part of the economy is to figure out what their essential interests are and then move to exclude others. And they do that, in many cases out of an obligation to that first solitude I mentioned, which is ensuring the safety and security of citizens. It's not only a noble objective, it is for many of us, it is the first duty of the state. Talk to us about the implications of a world in which supply of critical minerals, and Janet has just gone through the list, lithium, graphite, cobalt, to say nothing of the rare earth elements, is controlled by a state defined by Canada in many ways as a non-like-minded state, not a democracy, not aligned in interest with Canada. What sort of risks does this pose for Canada, and how serious are those risks?
Palpable. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks to Janet for setting the table so well in terms of defining the supply scarcity of this. Just to think a little bit further about that demand side, over 200 battery production facilities are going to be established around the world in the next years. And there's not enough supply yet to produce enough batteries that the world intends to produce as part of the energy transition or as part of the semiconductor requirements for the Internet of Things around the world. Now, zeroing in a little bit on China, during the 1990s, Chinese leaders watched in horror as the Soviet Union disintegrated and its assets were privatized. Having seen how business interests threatened to take over the state in Russia, which is a key issue that we're noticing in geopolitics in the world today, Beijing since determined to make sure that the same disaster does not befall China. And this tracks with President Xi Jinping's rise, whose history before becoming General Secretary of the Communist Party was to ensure party presence across executive levels in all Chinese enterprises, to ensure commercial leaders could never rival political ones. And thus China, in the last decade, has begun to focus on weaponizing commerce for political means. It's a departure from the norms of the 90s that actually fueled China's rise prior to Xi Jinping. Granted, China had been granted over the 90s most favored nation status by Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. China had been admitted to the World Trade Organization as a means to help resolve disputes. More recently, it has consolidated its control over Hong Kong, which it used over the course of the 90s to learn about Western finance and development schemes that they migrated onshore to Shanghai and Shenzhen. So much of the world's democracies, market democracies, in the management of supplies of critical minerals and other resources, bended the rules for China's model of state capitalism. And over the last decades, that state capitalism has manifested in what has been largely known as the Belt and Road Initiative. While dollar figures are opaque, it is a major investment fund and initiative for China to secure critical data, infrastructure, and resource interests around the world. The Communist Party of China sits back and has a map of the world and plans for the long term around the electrification of their own economy. They intend to have a fully electrified economy by 2040. And what that means is not only does China become a critical market for batteries and for electrification resources that Janet had described, it has positioned China strategically over these last decades to control strategic choke points around these critical minerals that would fuel that transition and that rise. What's most troubling is what has been happening recently. Despite the success of Chinese private enterprise fueling China's rise, when Xi Jinping arrived in 2012, he saw that infiltration of Communist Party agents across Chinese businesses, ultimately culminating in 2017 with the National Intelligence Law of China that, quote, any organization and citizen shall support and cooperate in national intelligence work, raising questions about the difference between private Chinese enterprise and public state Chinese enterprise. And that has left much of the Western world and the democratic world in a sense of disarray in thinking about their own economic arrangements, their own capital raising, their own means of engaging the Chinese market. The pandemic and other issues geopolitically and geoeconomics most recently, as February 4 and 5, during the Olympics when President Putin and President Xi Jinping declared unlimited partnerships for Russia and China in geoeconomics and geopolitics around the world, has brought a lot of what Janet described earlier in the United States and elsewhere into critical focus. And so when we think about this rising, gathering threat of this transformed economy, where hundreds of millions of people have made a transition from poverty to middle class, and where the Chinese economy now seeks to replace the American economy as a leader in the world, China's model of governance through its Belt and Road infrastructure, a model of hub and spokes, half hegemony in critical markets like the Democratic Republic of Congo and other areas that fit their economic schemes, their military schemes, and their political schemes, all are designed to fuel the rise of what China conceives of it as the Middle Kingdom, the restoration of China as a great and unifying power in the world. So Andrew, to your question around what does all that mean when it comes to national security? As you mentioned in your opening, the responsibility of all governments, first and foremost, is to secure the nation, the people of your country, the borders, the sovereignty of its ability. Second, to advance its prosperity, and third, to cooperate on the basis of your values. I would argue that that would should comprise a national interest agenda for democracies or for countries around the world. And in Canada, we have seen in in the early 2000s, basically the idea of Chinese investment in our oil fields and our energy sector. It raised the question of the Investment Canada Act, which in short, in sum, would declare that not all investment is created equal. It's neither an act of market infidelity or national security driven paranoia to limit state-owned enterprise investment in certain sectors or from certain countries. And it's a matter of really just seeing the world as it is. And so as a result of China's 2017 national intelligence law, what I would suggest Western markets need to contend with is to come to an understanding that not all Chinese investment, whether it's private or public, are anodyne. And for Canada specifically, all should be reviewed. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there's a bigger dialogue to have here around how we can focus on securing our critical mineral interests, empowering our incredible mining and minerals industry to succeed in the transition and technology challenges of the world to come, and in how we form partnerships toward that end.
Shuv, there's been so much talk over the last number of years in Canada, both in Parliament, I think in the think tank community, in the press particularly, and it's even pervaded our, I would say, popular political debate about, you know, foreign control of key Canadian assets, specifically of critical minerals. What has always sort of struck me is the underlying theme is that something unfair is happening here, something dangerous and something unfair. And it always tends to bring out for me a pretty harsh pep talk that I used to get from a high school coach. You know, our team would sort of sit around and complain about the other guys. The other guys are doing this. They're not being fair. They're not playing by the rules. And the pep talk went something like this: why don't you just play better? You know, stop worrying about the other guys and start worrying about your own game and what you're bringing to the court. And you know, as I hear you speak, there's so much here that is so legitimate and rings true in our mutual experience in government. And yet I'm also struck by the reality that competition really is the lifeblood of capitalism, which is the system that Canada subscribes to. Where would you look, or where would you point to in Canada's approach to critical minerals and say we could have done better in a competitive sense, as opposed to necessarily the blocking of deals, but simply excelling in that industry? Are the things that leap to mind? And we'll address this further in a subsequent theme. But while I've got you on this theme, are there things that were there moments that Canada just missed in securing its critical minerals future? And how can those be recovered?
You know, it's a great question, because when we think about our critical sectors in Canada, the strengths that Canada has as global leaders, I mean, it's in the natural resources space, whether it's oil and gas, energy transition technologies, or mining and minerals, and our financial services and our financial industry. These are natural strengths that Canada has around the world that positions our country as a global leader. I think one of the things that we were very successful at up until 2014 was to prepare for the trading architecture of the world to come, particularly in securing trade agreements with Europe and Asia, big deals that accelerated Canadian trade from having 5 agreements around the world to nearly 50. That's one big part of helping establish a baseline around the rules and norms of investment and business that actually stands ready to be awakened and animated. Where we fell short is to think about how do we actually promote those industries and resources, these companies that are operating as Canadian leaders around the world, as core national security, national prosperity interests, in ways that we can actually succeed in the world to come. So much of our trading relationship has been based on American success. 80% of our entire economy is built upon our partnership with the United States, and that's not a bad thing. But as these new markets galvanize and transform global order and geopolitics, geoeconomics, I think we've fallen behind the 8 ball a little bit in defining things like the critical mineral strategy that the government of Canada has yet to produce. I think that energy security, particularly when you think about the context of predatory practices by Russian industry in Europe and elsewhere, advancing Canadian energy interests around the world as a solution to the world's demand to grow and fuel their growth, are areas that we've fallen asleep at the switch on. So, also in the international fora, whether it is in the G7, G20, or in security organizations like NATO, Five Eyes, and new ones that are emerging, the Quad, AUKUS. I think Canadians are underserved by not more aggressively asserting how our supply and our companies are worthy of both investment and of promotion into these markets as a critical partner. And I think, that's probably how I would think about framing where we've not been as assertive or as aggressive as a nation as we should have been.
So I'm going to turn now to what I've described as a bit of a case study on the real world reality of the environment that Shuv has described, which is admittedly one that exhibits a certain amount of danger, a certain amount of threat to Canada's essential interests, and just compare and maybe contrast it to some on the ground business realities. And here I'll turn to Carlos for that case study. And Carlos, I realize this deal is still pretty fresh, and there is only so far you can go in talking to us about it. But I think there is a great deal of fascination with the recent deal with Zijin and Lithium. Can you just talk to us about your experience in that deal, and feel free to make reference to some of the things that both Janet and Shuv have described, those challenges in the international community. How do they impact deal making in your experience with Lithium? And just talk to us about the practical difficulties of getting the deal done in this sector and how you overcame those difficulties.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Janet and Shuv and everybody on this conference call. For people to understand, I think it's better to explain who we are quickly. I mean, who we were. So we are we started out in late 2015, early 2016. We discovered a property in Argentina with an Argentinian team, 100% Argentinian team, and then we surely but quickly put that project into, or listed it in the TSX venture, because as you know, the TSX is one of the premier, if not the best, I would say, explorer/developer stock exchange in the world, where you can raise money to develop the asset to a point where you want to, either develop it or sell it or merge it or whatever that may look like. So it's a prime place to have an asset in order to make it visible and finance. So that's what we did. We raised over $100 million all in through 5 years of work, exploration and development. And from the beginning, we were always trying to understand our strengths and weaknesses, in the sense that, look, we knew what team we had. We knew that we had quite a bit of knowledge on the exploration side. Our team had prior experience in Lithium America, so we knew quite well the lithium brine aspect of it up to development. So we had the same team. We essentially had that knowledge, but what we lacked was the downstream side of things, which is the processing and the final, I would say, lithium knowledge. But that's something you can acquire in the market. So from the beginning, we tried to bring in somebody that had that knowledge. And since 2017, I myself, even I was the CFO of the company, I essentially traveled the world. And when I say travel the world, we went to Europe, all parts of Europe, including Germany, the UK, and so forth. We went to Asia, and that includes China, Japan, Korea. We've been in South America. We've been everywhere, right? So we've talked to almost every single strategic and financier in the lithium space, because lithium, a lot of people think lithium is mining, but it isn't, right? It's more, I would say lithium brine is more equivalent to the oil and gas industry because it's liquid. Whereas the lithium, there's other types of ores that have brine, which is a hard rock, which is more traditional mining. So the knowledge on those that you need in your team is different between one and the other. So lithium, when you talk about lithium, well, there's different types of knowledges even within the lithium industry that you need to have internally. So we went to the market and we tried to source financing to develop the asset, not only to develop, but also to build it, and to make sure that this asset had the right people on board in order to make the project what I call, and I always said it, I'm a more pragmatic person, to transact. What my definition of transact is: either build it, or let somebody else build it and maximize the gains for our shareholders, which is what we were brought in to do. So during that period of time, we hired 3 banks. We started with one we didn't like, we fired, and then the next one we didn't like, we fired. And then the third one with Bank of America, we brought in, and it was a different time. Remember, lithium goes in, I would say, a big waves of you're up and you're down, you're up and you're down. We were very high and very low. And then obviously over the last year or so, things have gone very good, very well for everybody in the lithium space up to recently. And we were able to bring CATL at that time, and CATL came in and with a small toehold and provided some financing and knowledge on the downstream side. Now, CATL is also a Chinese battery manufacturer. In fact, is the largest battery manufacturer in the world. And just as a side note, China controls 70 to 80% of all battery manufacturing, lithium-ion battery manufacturing in the world. So that's obviously important because that is part of the end game. Where's the lithium going to? Well, to the batteries. And if you want to build batteries, you need raw material, right? So if China needs that, they are going to try to find that raw material wherever they can. So we brought in CATL, and that gave us quite a bit of understanding of what the product needed to look like. And we obviously wanted to then now finance the project. We brought it to feasibility. So we were pushing CATL. CATL didn't want to participate in the total financing of the project. So we started running a formal process even before CATL to finance completely. And we, again, scoured the entire world. And for many reasons, one would be jurisdictional risk. Our project's in Argentina. And by the way, just as a side note again, 95% of our team is Argentinian we have a couple of Chileans that have quite a bit of knowledge in the brine because, as you know, the 2 biggest brine assets is in Salar de Atacama in Chile, and they are the most knowledgeable individuals in the brine space. And also, you just can't find them. So in Argentina, also they've built other assets in Argentina. So that's our team. In terms of Canadian people, you had me and you had, the board, right? So our asset is essentially an Argentinian asset that is listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange. So we were trying to find ways to finance it. We scoured the world, and for reasons of jurisdictional risk, some companies did not want to invest in Argentina for any number of reasons. Banks were not capable of financing any type of project financing, and so forth. And I can go into details in terms of which were more, I would say, negative than others, and in terms of Europe and so forth. We brought in Germans, we brought in obviously Chinese, we brought in Koreans, we brought in Japanese. We talked to everybody. And at the end of the day, the only capable company that was willing to build the asset were Chinese companies. Why? Because they needed the asset, they needed the I would say the raw material to build the batteries. And by the way, they also had the knowledge. They had the end game knowledge of what type of material they needed to build the lithium carbonate in this case, which is what we're going to produce. So it bode well for us. And long story short, we ended up selling the company to Zijin, but it wasn't our intention to sell. It was the intention more or less to joint venture. But when we started negotiations, it was clear that they wanted 100% of the offtake. So at the end of the day, if you can give them 100% of the offtake and you'll just be an operator, well, what are you really doing? You're essentially selling the company to them. So might as well sell all of it and let them take all the risk, operational risk, right? Because if you sell all the offtake, then there's nothing left to give anybody else. So you can control an asset in many different ways, and offtake control is one of those ways. So that's I would say that's the practical experience. We weren't set to do. We were just trying to maximize. I would say the value to all our stakeholders, which include obviously our shareholders, and of course Argentina stakeholders as well, right? So we wanted this asset to be developed. The Argentinian government was very adamant that they wanted this asset to be producing and financed. So we were trying to work around those metrics in order to provide our shareholders with the best possible avenue. And that what we ended up doing was selling to Zijin to provide that.
Well, Carlos, this is fascinating to listen to as someone who's worked in the M&A space and worked with clients trying to figure out what the regulatory risks are. I'm just going to read some headlines to you here. This is literally from a live Google News search. Here's what it says. These are the headlines. U.S. Congress unhappy with Canada for permitting sale of neolithium. Members of Congress, U.S. Congress, call out Canada for approving neolithium. U.S. lawmakers assail Canada over neolithium. Industry minister under fire for testimony to Parliament. Are you surprised at the level of surprise in relation to this deal? You've just told us you spent 2 years looking for investment. You were open to any number of deal structures, including a joint venture. And at the end of the day, what you came to was a deal with Zijin, which has now has been successfully implemented. When you read these headlines, one is almost left with the impression of secrecy or that something unknown or untoward has happened. And yet when I listened to you, it sounds like you were very open-minded about investment from any number of sources and not just in one part of the world, but globally. Maybe you can unpack for us the difficulty you had in those conversations, including with banks. You said something so interesting to us the other day in our prep time about obtaining financing on a single asset, especially an asset that is located outside of Canada. I think a lot of our listeners would be fascinated to hear more about that story.
Yeah, sure. So I was, to tell you the truth, personally, look, I follow politics as a normal person would. I'm not an expert in politics, and of course, there's some discourse there that I'm not in agreement with. I was surprised by the level of, I would say, news that was talked about us. I think they don't really understand the facts, to tell you the truth, and I'll be completely honest. I was online when they had I can't remember, Andrew, help me, when they had the conversation between that group of people here in Canada, and they were talking about our asset and why they wanted a review and why was a review didn't happen and so forth. And when they described why they wanted a review and why they didn't do a review, it didn't make any sense to me in terms of how they should look at an asset like ours. For example, nobody made a comment except one person that this asset is essentially 100% in Argentina. We don't have a step in Canada. So for me, that's the most important part of the whole, I would say, argument. The Argentinian government would have a lot more veto over any asset that our Canadian government should have. Our entire team, 95% of our team is from the region in Argentina. There's no IP here in Canada. All we did in Canada was essentially list in the Toronto Stock Exchange. We marketed the deal to investors in the region, not only Canadians. I mean, we have a huge following in the US and Europe as well. So for me, it was not, I would say, it was surprising, to say the least. That was the tone, but I think they don't know the facts. They just see the headline, they make a comment, they see that neolithium is a Canadian listed company, so they assume that it's a Canadian asset that got sold to China. That's wrong. That wasn't the case. In fact, it's completely opposite. And we try to go through many avenues to finance in Canada, with Canadian institutions, with US institutions, even with European institutions. So a typical bank financing, as many people may or may not know here in a bank, is impossible to do. A one asset company, listed company, one asset in Argentina, no bank in Canada would ever lend to that company in Argentina, 100%. So that was off the table. So a debt financing in this case, which would not entail all equity, would have to be done in a very, I would say, with not strategics or private equity that had the wherewithal to invest in Argentina. And not many people do, because Argentina, obviously, as you know, has a pretty strong foreign exchange policy that you cannot extract some of the dollars that you may do. So it's very, I would say, hard to work in that region. Not impossible, but hard. So the people that were interested in financing our asset were not many. So we needed to find 500 million plus to finance this asset over the long period of time. And there were very few people that were able to do so. So we tried. We went to Canada, the US, we went to Germany. In fact, like I mentioned to you before the call started, we had the first team of people that came and visit our asset were Germans. This was a team of Germans, I can't remember the team itself, what they're called, but they were a team of very technical people that came to see our asset, and they were exactly looking for assets that mirrored what the critical materials were for Germany. And they were trying to find these assets, and then from there they would pitch these assets to the likes of Volkswagen and all the industry in Germany. Of course, as you know, they're the #1 producer of cars in the world, so obviously it was important for them. But we couldn't get them over the line as well, and we were very close to some of the Germans, but we just couldn't get there. I mean, obviously they were asking too much, or they simply left the table in terms of negotiation. So at the end of the day, I was surprised about the level of scrutiny. I don't think people really understand the level of sophistication and work that we did to try to finance this deal. We exhausted all avenues, to tell you the truth, and we needed to come to a conclusion in terms of how to finance this project going forward. And the only viable solution that we had, without giving away all the offtake, which potentially giving away all the offtake to, again, a Chinese, was to sell the asset or joint venture with a Chinese. So we opted to sell the asset completely because it would make the most sense to us at that point.
So I want to bring both Janet and Shuv into this case study. And Janet, first to you. I'm on my other screen here. I'm looking at the very smart looking graphic that's been put out by our friends at Natural Resources Canada. It really is nice. It's for those who haven't seen it, it's the stylized maple leaf, and each point in the maple leaf is a critical mineral, and it equals 31. Right at the top of the maple leaf, or in that top tier, lithium. And I'm listening to Carlos talk about the extent of their efforts to get financing and to find interested buyers. We've listened to Shuv about global competition, hegemony in the international system, focused on these critical minerals. Janet, you've talked to us about the importance at a national security level of critical minerals in the fight against climate change. I'll ask Janet first, then Shuv. Give me your reaction to what you're hearing from Carlos. And what I'm detecting here is a serious and significant gap between what we are saying about the critical minerals global struggle, and what producers are practically experiencing on the ground, literally. Janet, what's your take on what you've heard from Carlos?
First, thank you for sharing the details of the neolithium story, Carlos. It's really interesting. It's a real benefit to have some of that background. I think it helps people wrap their heads around what happened and why. One of the comments Carlos made really resonates with me, because it's something you see a lot in the context of M&A transactions, where you have a foreign acquirer interested in a mining company target. And before I unpack that, I think it's important to recognize mining, as we all know, is a global industry. It's a global sector. Mining projects are located all over the world, not just in Canada. And they tend to be financed from specific regions. The UK, lots of mining companies are listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange. China has money that it's now starting to invest in the mining companies. So money comes from certain jurisdictions of the world. And the projects, just because that's the way it works, are located in different jurisdictions. So when Carlos flags neolithium's projects were not located in Canada, that's meaningful. So when someone draws a connection to, is that project really tied in some way to promote national security for Canadians? That's an important consideration to make. There are other lithium projects that are located in Canada, and Nemaska is one, that might be more relevant to that conversation with respect. Is there a role for the Canadian regulators to really play in terms of focusing their energies on where they can have a meaningful impact? The second thing I would note, money has flowed into these companies through the ability to access Canadian capital markets. That doesn't necessarily mean it's Canadian funds, but they've been listed on the Canadian stock exchanges. So it just positions the Canadian regulators with the opportunity to weigh in. And it's not my role to comment on what that may mean or what Canadian government should do. But, you know, Andrew, you're the expert in terms of what needs to pass muster. And Carlos, when you mentioned, remind me of the name of the regulator, it might have been Industry Canada, in terms of having to consider whether transaction needed to be reviewed, what's the potential impact on national security. And I'll just offer comment, just no judgment, no immediate conclusion. It's just how the process works. Industry Canada gets involved, considers transactions where these issues come to bear. And a lot of the times they focus on what type of undertakings need to be entered into. And traditionally, those undertakings have taken the form: maintain your head office in Canada for a certain period of time, consider what Canadian residents you have on the board of directors and maintain their involvement for a certain period of time. Is the opportunity right now to consider expanding the role for those undertakings to require a foreign acquirer to promise to provide offtake rights to critical mineral streams? So depending on where capital has come from, is it a reasonable ask? Requiring foreign acquirers to finance the construction of refineries that might be used. If a mining resource reserve is located in Canada, does it make sense for a foreign acquirer to finance the construction of refineries, processing plants domestically to create jobs and promote processing here? So it's just understanding the concerns that are legitimately raised and how best to resolve them, I think, is a helpful way to frame that conversation.
Shuv, over to you, and please feel free to comment on what Janet has brought to the discussion as well. And here I really am focused on, I think, what are two very legitimate sides of this discussion or debate, and it's so fascinating to hear Carlos's sort of lived experience in this sphere, and yet no one disagrees that there's a real problem globally. How do we bring these two solitudes together and make sense of them?
Well, you know, when the Investment Canada Act was established, it was principally to focus on state-owned investment. And I think what we have yet to kind of wrap our heads around is, how does China and other predatory investors that are seeking to undo our democratic capitalist system invest through our democratic capitalist system? In the United States, they've established a presidential working group on financial markets, which are focused on studying different practices of Chinese companies listed in the US and otherwise to help protect and support US investors in financial markets. That's something I think that in Canada we need better awareness and better literacy of, and something that I think the government of Canada has a role to play in partnership with the Canadian industries. Australia has recently set up a $1.5 billion US facility to spur investment in Australian critical mineral sectors. And you know, this is another jurisdiction that is a global market leader in the investment space and in the mineral space. And the work that Australia has done in this to secure their own supply chains and their own interests around the world when it comes to their critical minerals, I think, has been focused on enabling galvanizing capital toward projects that folks like Carlos have been working on. In fact, Carlos, I have a great deal of empathy for your capital raising adventure. It seems like it's very difficult to be able to get markets to appreciate how to take advantage of opportunities like the one that you proposed. And I think much of the frustration in the United States, if I might comment, comes from a strategic perspective that they've been having for quite some time. I mean, China right now is South America's largest trading partner. In 2019 alone, China invested $2.8 billion in the region. Maybe 19 to 20 Latin American countries have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it's not an accident that China's Neolithium investment in January was followed by Argentinian President Fernandez's joining the Belt and Road Initiative in February. That agreement that occurred just last month spends billions of investment, including nuclear power outside of Buenos Aires, beef soybean trade, Argentinian-Chinese economic diplomacy. This all started in 2017 with the frustrating Kirchner regime in Argentina that had been looking at courting Chinese investment, and the Chinese investment community had been identified Argentina as a key strategic priority for quite some time. They had come to an agreement on things like commercial space tracking, monitoring space in Argentina, which was also done in the same year as China's national intelligence law in 2017. So Argentina has been a focused investment opportunity, a target for Chinese investment as part of their global Belt and Road Initiative for quite some time. Perhaps that's why the economics of the neo-lithium deal seemed so attractive to them, because it was a piece of the puzzle that fit into something wider that China was looking to accomplish there. Other tools that have been emerging recently in finance include the US-led Blue Dot Network, which has also been noticed by the OECD. The Blue Dot Network is a fund that is a mechanism to identify projects like these in Argentina that have critical national supply security risks associated to them. They're designed for developing countries, emerging economies that are being courted by Chinese capital. And it's a network backed by the US, Japanese, and some others to try and identify ways to mobilize investment around these strategic priorities for long-term Western and democratic supply chain interests. I would identify that as something that is beginning to come into focus, but has not yet quite gotten up to the pace that it needs to be able to become an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative's presence in these types of markets. And finally, Dr. Jack Mintz, my friend and colleague, distinguished fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, published recently how in the corporate world in the West at large, there's been a big debate about ESG and how corporations will try and define what that means for their business practices, their investments. It's become clear, particularly with what we've seen in Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's practices across Europe, plus the Chinese-Russian economic relationship, that in addition to ESG, the dimension of security needs to be something that is contemplated around commercial transactions, including in case studies like the one that Carlos so nicely put us through.
So what I'd like to do right now is just to get very, very practical about the potential suggestions we would put out there for not only our viewers, and I just wanted to say hello to those who are joining via LinkedIn Live. Nice to have you with us as well today. I'll give some categories to some options that we might consider. You have things like forms of subsidization or inducements, including tax treatment. Those are some options that we might consider. Let me also talk about lowering regulatory barriers. This could be on permitting, could be on environmental assessments. And then of course, we would not want to talk about that area without also acknowledging the growing and incredible importance of ESG issues, concerns. Let me just give you a couple of examples, international comparative examples. Shuv, you mentioned something that the Australians are doing in order to encourage and promote critical minerals in their jurisdiction. The Australians have a $2 billion loan facility for Australian critical mineral projects. That's not a small chunk of change. Japan is stockpiling 34 rare minerals that they believe are critical to their economy. And it's apparently on a 60-day cycle to make sure that they have at least 60 days supply domestically held in order to avoid some of the shortfalls that we have recently seen, particularly in and around semiconductors. Has anyone tried to buy an oven lately or a car? This is a real problem. The EU has invested 373 million euro in rare earth research and innovation. And the Americans have gone so far as to provide funding opportunities under their Defense Production Act. That's quite the piece of legislation. You hear more and more about the Defense Production Act in the US and its many tentacles. But one of the things I think the United States does particularly well is define and settle upon its national interests and then get very practical about operationalizing those interests in an economic sense. Maybe I'll just go back to Carlos for a moment, and also to Shuv and Janet in sequence. What are the things that you'd like to see Canada do? Just maybe choose one each that you feel would make a difference in rebalancing the decks internationally and addressing some of the issues that we face in the security realm, and also the practical business realities that Carlos has identified. So Carlos, to you first, what would you love to see the government of Canada do?
I may get in trouble for this, but just essentially leave us alone. Exactly what you're trying, exactly what they've been doing. I think, look, first of all, every country is trying to get this new strategy of critical minerals. Every country. So Canada has one, the US has one, Chile has one, Argentina has one, Mexico has one. Why are we doing 30 types of strategies when it's one region? Theoretically, this region should work together in a way that benefits all of us here, right? If all the governments think that the East is trying to take all the raw materials somehow and stash them and essentially not let us produce batteries or sell it to us at a price that's not going to be convenient for us, then take action complete, and take action in a way that is meaningful, because Canada by itself cannot do it. When, Andrew, when you mentioned that the Australian government put $2 billion fund, that's peanuts. You know how much money CATL has just to invest in raw material? 2.5 billion US, just CATL. Forget about the Chinese government. This is CATL, a company that is listed. So that is not 2 billion is nothing. That will, it is, I guess it could help a company or two, but that's not a long-term strategy. A long-term strategy has to be much bigger than that. So, I would tend to think, look, the Canadian government for many, many years has provided a platform for companies to develop, explore and develop assets, and then let them go, and to give those assets to larger companies in order to further develop and build. That is a beautiful platform that the Canadian government has been able to develop on the TSX and TSX Venture. I don't think we should change any of that, because I think we were talking a couple of days ago before this meeting that if you put too many restrictions and so forth, people will leave the Canadian market and go to another market to finance. They will go to Australia, they would go to the UK, they may go somewhere else, they may even go to Asia. Why? Because it's just a much broader market. You get better valuations, you'll be able to raise more money, and it's just easier, right? So I would tend to think that the lower the restrictions, but have a concise strategy, a very holistic strategy for the region, because Canada can come up with a beautiful strategy, but if the US says, nah, I don't think so, then what are we doing? We're really not doing. Canada does not have any knowledge in the lithium brine space, zero knowledge, zero. But they have other knowledge. They have two assets like Janet was talking to about. In the Quebec, they have Nemaska and they have Canada Lithium. These assets have had trouble past, but I believe hopefully that, over the near future, these will develop. They have another asset in Ontario with Frontier. They're trying to develop other types of brines in the West Coast, which I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but they do have some lithium knowledge, but they don't have all the knowledge. They don't have any manufacturing of batteries. They don't have any processing capacity. So, you cannot have a strategy when you lack the infrastructure and you lack the knowledge. So you need to work with other parts of the world, which is, in this case, it could be the US, it could be Chile, it could be Argentina, it could be all of them, and then have a strategy within that region, a much larger fund in order to develop, but do not put restrictions to a point where let's say our group would have said, no, it doesn't make any sense to list in Toronto. We're going to list in, I don't know, an Australian Stock Exchange because of this reasons. So I think that would be my interpretation. I'm trying to be pragmatic and easy. I like easy things, and I don't believe if we overcomplicate, people will see right through and they'll just leave, right? So that's just my own opinion.
So Carlos, you did mention this in our prep session. I took particular note of it because it's a pretty ominous prediction. I think your prediction was between a 20 and 50% drop in folks listing in Canada if we were to outright ban investment from certain countries. That it just isn't how the international marketplace works. It's not how capital flows. And at the same time, we have these very, very real concerns that Shuv has expressed that are encapsulated in the Investment Canada Act and operationalized, as Janet mentioned, by the Investment Review Division. Shuv, maybe to you for the top thing, you may or may not have officials of the Government of Canada listening right now. And Carlos, no one will be in trouble. We're just having a chat here today. Shuv, what would you like to see Canada do? In a moment, we'll move to the issue of international cooperation, but to see something from Canada, Shuv, what would it be?
Okay, well, holding back on international cooperation, because I think it's a big part of what Canada should do. You know, I'm a capitalist like anybody. During the government that Andrew and I served, you know, Canadian international development investments of $5 billion a year. A big part of that was focused on trying to support how extractive industries in foreign markets can be used to improve governance and quality of life outcomes through tax revenues. These are all things that I think are healthy as part of a free trading world. The issue is that in 2010, when Japan came under Chinese coercive pressure for a territorial dispute, what we saw was the weaponization of commerce, which is usually laid outside of the purview of competition between different models of governance, whether it was industrial espionage or manipulating supply chains. Not all capital is neutral. And I think that, you know, as much as I think, you know, we have succeeded in building our democratic capitalist model, we, as Prime Minister Harper has said in the past, we didn't build it for a state-owned one to buy it out. And I think that in the face of that threat that is being presented to global capital markets, global governance, jurisdictions around the world, it is incumbent on international cooperation among democratic governments to be able to assure security around the kind of risks that Japan had experienced. That was a devastating experience that the Japanese had gone through. So because of those reasons, we've seen these critical mineral strategies being developed by different jurisdictions. So what's the one thing that I would do or say is the most important? I would say Ottawa needs to focus on defining our national interests and then acting on them. And that doesn't mean just securing Canadian capital markets, but Canadian, you know, mineral interests. It means advancing them as a priority of what the Government of Canada pursues in its economic diplomacy around the world. So much of the last decade has been focused on things that are more performative, when instead, you know, the real world and its economics are changing. New opportunities for cooperation are presenting themselves. Companies and corporate leaders like Carlos and others who are literate and really strong in an understanding of these markets need to be not just heard, but also plugged into financial opportunities. While, you know, the Australian loan guarantee facility is small, the United States did establish a $60 billion fund to be able to invest through their development finance corporations into projects specifically that would fit within the parameters of what I think Neolithium was experiencing. There's many other projects like that around the world that fall under a very similar profile that I think are very attractive and are more of an interest because of the national security interests that they present. So I'll leave it at that. I'd say that the most important thing is for the Canadian government to define that we have these interests and then to actually begin taking the steps to advance them.
Janet, over to you. What would be those steps? If you had to pick a step that the Government of Canada ought to take in this realm, what would it be?
I promise to be quick. I've got two, all right?
Fair enough.
The first thing that I think would be a helpful thing to do is to start linking economic reconciliation with our Indigenous communities with the need for Canada's assertion of sovereignty in the North. So there's a lot of important conversation that's happening right now that relates to consultation with Indigenous communities, making sure that they're participating and being considered in connection with the construction of projects. Linking that effort to the fact that there's a need to address what some are starting to recognize as being complacency regarding the strategic significance of Canada's North might be a good idea to do. And the circumpolar regions come to mind. So people are used to focusing on the globe from the side. If you turn it and flip it and look at it from the top, you've got Russia you've got Canada, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Alaska, the US. It's the Arctic 8. And when you think about mining, a lot of the continents have been explored, they've been exploited, but up in the north, there's tremendous unexplored potential, and people are focused on it. Ice melt, shipping channels open in terms of exports, ports, all the rest of it. I think there's going to be a lot of important activity that in my lifetime, at least those on this call, are going to be faced with. And the second thing, training, I think, is critical. There's a stat that a lot of the mining companies are starting to focus on, the percentage of senior people who are set to retire and leave the industry. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity to excite the next generation. If there's effort that the government can do to facilitate the promotion of mining as an industry that can promote positive change, focusing on the ESG. There's a question in the chat about ESG principles. Are people focused on it? I think mining companies, the big ones, are very much focused on the need to integrate ESG criteria, not only describing how it comes to bear with what they're doing, but actually implementing internal systems and controls to make sure that they're actually implementing meaningful strategies. Those are the types of initiatives that I think encourage younger people. They're looking for people to be socially responsible on all of those fronts, and a career in mining, focusing efforts on assisting on all of these matters. It's an exciting opportunity for young people to get involved. So training them and making sure, to Carlos's point, that we're not caught having a lack of experienced people with the knowledge and the know-how to grow the industry in the right direction, in the way I think younger people are hoping it can take.
So a really good point, Janet, about ESG components, and with 20 minutes remaining in our session, I do want to save some time for questions, and there are some in the chat. But I do want to get to our final theme, and Shu, I'm going to throw this immediately to you. I previewed a question that I wanted to put to the group, which is as follows: is the West being tested, and are we passing that test? And how will we know if we're passing that test? And feel free, because I think it's impossible to ignore the context we're in. Many people watching are, I'm sure, watching one screen, which is us, and the other screen is the CNN or CBC headlines flowing by, coming out of Ukraine right now. Is there a broader struggle here? Are we being tested? And how are we passing that test, if indeed we are?
100% we are being tested. And we have been tested ever since Xi Jinping launched his Belt and Road Initiative and accelerated over the last decade. We are seeing a time in which commodity prices will create massive inflationary pressures on all our economies. At precisely the time post-pandemic, we're trying to find ways to, central banks are trying to find ways to manage our recovery. So this geoeconomic, geopolitical competition that Russia has begun with its invasion of Ukraine is principally financed and backed by China. At the end of the day, in so many ways, the Russian economy is a gas station to China. 70% of Russian energy is purchased by China. And in February, a pipeline deal for gas had been signed between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping that would guarantee a 30-year low-cost deal. 30% of that sales goes to Europe, which I think, countries like Canada can play a critical part in North America and in Europe in displacing as a more reliable, sustainable source of energy. We're not here to talk about energy, but I think when you look at natural resources, critical minerals, as well as energy security, 100%, the name of the game is geoeconomic growth. In the jobs that I've held, that you've held, you'll recall that 80% of foreign policy itself is about economics. 20% is about international security in terms of the substance. But when economics and security conflict, it captures global attention. And that's exactly the moment that we found ourselves in today, coming into acute focus over the tragedy in the lives of Ukrainians. Now, are we passing the test? That's a great question. I think that we are struggling as democracies, as market democracies, to define a common threat, a common rivalry. We have seen, hot and cold approaches towards Russian and Chinese markets, principally from those that have more reliance on them. In Canada, we have a lot more independence just because of our relationship with the United States, but other countries around the world do not have that luxury, whether they're developing or more established. But what we have seen in Berlin just in the last couple of weeks is a dramatic shift in their appreciation of the kind of threat that state reliance or national reliance on predatory state practices, oligarchical or otherwise state-owned, present to their economy, and are beginning to respond to the decoupling, the economic decoupling, and the ideological dual circulation philosophy of Xi Jinping. I mean, it's not that globalization is something that is not an extension, that's not being extended to illiberal regimes, whether they be Russian or Chinese. It's that those countries have decided to decouple and delink from ours already by making decisions that are predatory in their capital deployments, in their manipulation of supply chains, whether it's energy, minerals, health, or other critical commodities and services. And the West is catching up. The democratic world is catching up to how it's going to respond. At the G7 in 2021, at Cornwall, which incidentally is just off the shores of Cornwall, is one of the biggest lithium potential deposits that could support the United Kingdom's own energy transition in the coming years. They announced a G7 investment screening expert group to try and tackle some of these investment questions, but I think it's coming together too slowly to respond to the threat. In the quadrilateral security dialogue, which includes Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, what 10 years ago was just a loose grouping and a conversation, today with its summit in Australia has become a much more articulated question of, military naval interoperability on one side, yes, but also economic security among trusted democracies, trusted markets on the other side. And they have recognized the need for new, more secure critical minerals value chains, which reflects our shared interests in ensuring more secure supplies to support the clean energy transition, the relevant industrial capabilities, to play a greater role in the value chains, and their increasingly contested relationships with China. And since 2019, they've focused on their complementarities for massive economies. Australia is the world's leading upstream critical minerals producer and has ambitions to move into the midstream processing space. India has a low-cost manufacturing capacity required for success at the downstream end, particularly in batteries and other technologies. Japan and the United States have significant technological and financial resources to develop new value chains and new products. And there's ample scope to combine all of these within the Quad. India and Taiwan have announced a $7.5 billion deal to set up semiconductor manufacturing capacity in India, which is a massive shift away from other semiconductor producing states that have a chokehold over the products that markets around the world will be demanding. And the Australia, UK, United States trilateral announcement created a lot of news about common development of the modern capital ship replacing aircraft carriers. What we now see as a modern capital ship is nuclear submarines. And the value chain that created is important, but what is even more important in the AUKUS deal is the relationships that are being defined in technology investment, ranging from quantum AI and other technologies made possible by critical minerals. So today, the NATO foreign ministers are meeting to discuss what their collective response will be to Russian aggression in Ukraine. I wonder how much the question of natural resources and allied supply security will feature in those discussions. NATO has a center of excellence on things like strategic resources that should be feeding into their thinking. And of course, among the Five Eyes, which Canada is a part, which is the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and us. I fear that we're being a bit left behind in terms of how those other partners are working to come to a common understanding of the economic risks to our shared market potential. But I think that presents a final area in which cooperation can be enhanced with like-minded nations.
Shuv, it's powerful to hear your sense of this, and you come at this from such a well-informed perspective. It's also so great, Carlos, I think, to have you from a practical perspective, and you made comment on this a few minutes ago. You talked about people, countries that excel in certain parts of, and you know the lithium industry so well. Give us your sense of if you had to put together a dream team of lithium exploration, extraction, production. What countries would you pair with? Like, how would that work in your mind if you were practically to assemble what Shuv is talking about, which is a coalition of the Western like-minded? What does it look like for you? Oh, I think you're still on mute.
I guess it will depend on the type of asset, right? So if Canada wanted to have their own strategy and wanted to see who they would pair, it would be people like Australia, because Australia has quite a bit of hard rock assets where Canada has. However, now there are certain assets in Canada and on the West that potentially have what I call petrobrine, which is it's not same as brine as in that we have in Argentina, but different kind of brine on the West side, which nobody really has much knowledge there. So it's a new technology that is developing. So the lithium industry, and I'm talking just in lithium, right? Because there's other things, there's cobalt, there's graphite, there's many other critical elements that potentially can be an issue here. And not all have the same type of players. So in the lithium space, Australia, unfortunately, China is a big player here. You need to understand what they're doing. The same thing that they did for many years, that they try to understand what we've been doing for many years. We should also learn from them, because this goes both ways, and they are very knowledgeable in the lithium space, extremely knowledgeable. In fact, they are the most knowledgeable people in the world. Of course, there are people that for example, Chile, Argentina, those are lithium brine assets. But in terms of hard rock, Australia would be number one right now, because they have developed and been able to put a lot of projects into production in Australia. And we here, unfortunately, for one reason or another, haven't been able to do so, both in, like I mentioned, in Nemaska and Canada Lithium. So obviously there are some, I would say, links to those industries. So it would be somewhere in the region of Australia, Canada, Chile, Argentina, of course, the US is trying to develop, and they're so big, they're trying to develop some assets. There are smaller productions of assets in the US, and because they're so big and there's future development of new assets in the US has to be part of this, of course. So those would be, out of top of my mind. Of course, maybe there's one here that I missed, but those are the bigger ones that I can see that will help further develop our assets and our knowledge in the sector.
Look, as we wind down today's session, I do want to address a question that's come to us, which I think is really powerful and it's very important. And Janet, I'm going to send this one to you because you've raised ESG a couple of times, and it's an area that Fasken practices in, and I know is reinforced around here. The question is this: with so much talk today aligning capital and ESG values, we still have today a factual landscape where solar panels are sourced / made in Eastern Turkestan, lithium mined in Tibet, cobalt mined in the DRC. Do any of you see a clear policy from capital allocators that insist that both environmental and human rights are fully respected in a company's supply chain? Are each of the E, the S, and the G all getting serious attention and consideration? This is a tough question when you think about. Let's take cobalt in the DRC. There are not only human rights issues in play. There are, because of the way the element is extracted, there are environmental concerns. How is it, if we've agreed, as President Biden would have us agree, that the environment, for instance, is now a matter of national security, that we do more than pay lip service to the fact that human rights need to be part of Canada's essential interests, even as we project our foreign policy abroad? How do we ensure that ESG values are woven into whatever we do in upping our game in the critical mineral space as a country?
Thank you for the submission of the question. It's a really good one. And to answer it, I'd like to focus on the reference to the capital allocator. So I think it's centered around, is there a clear policy from capital allocators that insist on all of the ESG being acknowledged and recognized? So I focus on who are the capital allocators. I think one of the reasons ESG has gotten so much credible attention as of late is because the institutional investors who are deploying capital are insisting that attention be focused on the ESG related criteria for the purposes of explaining how are you addressing some very meaningful risks that could have an impact on your potential profitability going forward. And I'm thinking of Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, pension plans, strategic shareholders who are starting to recognize the importance of considering whether access to capital or renewing capital you can be cut off if you haven't paid proper attention to these ESG related criteria across the board. So even though I think in the media and the news, there's a lot of attention being given to environmental concerns, I'm seeing a lot of focus on the human rights issues. There's legislation that's being proposed that my colleagues are better positioned than I to describe status, but people are very interested in making sure that supply chains are diligenced. So there's proper focus and attention paid to where critical minerals, any type of commodities are being supplied from and how you track it. And Andrew, to your point, you raised a question, how do we make sure that all of this is being implemented in the way that is necessary to have a meaningful impact? I think a year, 2 years ago, people were focused on what is ESG, what are the criteria? And now the focus has turned to implementing the criteria. So companies are talking about how to actually implement the protocols, the policies to make sure that they can show that they've integrated these criteria, these considerations into their operations in the form of controls, how you're disclosing certain required information to showcase. Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions is a good one. To the person's question about human rights and supply chain, doing the diligence on the ground to make sure you've done the investigative work. And I think we're not too far away from a scenario where you've got the capacity to audit whether or not those internal controls and procedures are sound. So just like financial auditors audit financial statements, a CEO and a CFO have to certify that the financial statements are produced in a way that is informed by sound policies, procedures, protocols. That type of scrutiny is starting to occur from the perspective of, are you sure your policies, controls are properly implemented for the purposes of properly identifying whether or not your recognition of the relevant ESG related criteria for your operations have been properly identified? And are you making good in your commitments to address those things so that those protocols can be properly audited and attested to?
Shuv, I'm going to turn to you, and this may be our the beginning of our closing. You mentioned Stephen Harper a few minutes ago, and I can't help because you and I talk Stephen Harper frequently. If he's listening, it's almost always good. One of the things he did, along with his cabinet, when it came to figuring out our essential interests, I'm thinking of one particular transaction that is sort of now quite famous in Canada. This was the CNOC deal. He was able to say, along with cabinet, this far and no further. And I thought that was a fascinating exercise. There was so much public talk about that. And you'll recall that he actually took to the podium and spoke to the press for almost an hour on his vision of foreign investment. There was recently an ATIP that was issued that talked about the central importance of foreign direct investment to Canada's recovery from COVID-19. This wasn't meant to be a public statement. It's something that came out through access to information. In that line drawing exercise, do you see Canada moving to a place where it has to get very practical about our essential interests? Or do we continue to sort of exist in anticipation of strategies? Are we going to be forced into a position where we get this figured out and quick?
The Investment Canada Act is a tool we already have to respond to these threats. What it has not yet done, what has not yet been defined is the scope of investment, foreign direct investment, that the Investment Canada Act would look at. Right now, it's limited to state-owned investment. I think that the security community of Canada that's looking at how to consider investment under review need to take a deeper, more broader sense as to what that scope should be about investment. And to your point, I think that there aren't that many countries in the world that operate with these types of huge predatory practices for the sake of leveraging economic control toward political means. There's only a handful of them. And by designating those countries as concerned capital, we'll have the opportunity to at least take pause before deciding whether that capital affects the national security of the country or of our alliances or the supply chains that we all critically need to reliably succeed. So I think, that line has yet to be defined by Canadians, and I think in other parts of the world as well, in terms of how to engage that kind of capital. And so I'll leave it at that for now. But I think that at the macro level, democracies, markets around the world that are based on the rule of law, the so-called rules-based international system, are still trying to wrap their arms around defining what the strategic threat is of illiberal regimes and designating them as such, and come up with common cause to be able to establish more trusted supply chains and trusted investment portals among them. And when you think about the kind of diligencing that's been done in East Turkestan or in Tibet region, we're talking about regions of China that are experiencing genocide. They don't require a great deal of diligence to know the facts around it. You've had parliaments and experts around the world to testify about that. You've had people from these places testifying about the perils of doing that trade. It's more than just being able to thread the needle on this. It is about taking a step back and understanding that these critical minerals, these products, are actually being used to undermine the market democracy that we in Canada have spent hundreds of years building, that are now being challenged directly by authoritarians who seek to replace this system entirely.
We are at time. I just want to say a very warm thank you to each of the panelists who appeared today and brought such vibrant and different perspectives to something that I think is going to become an even bigger debate in Canada and around the world. Thank you to those who've joined us, and wishing you and yours a great day. I know we live, as I said, in difficult times, and we're certainly thinking about anyone who has family in harm's way right now. Thanks very much for joining us, and stay safe.